Hi, Mark. You're good to go live.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Just to
Thank you.
verify, you can hear me coming through there and you can see my slides. Yeah,
I can. Yep, you are live now.
perfect. Thank you.
All the
Hello,
best.
everybody. It's super to be here. It's 11 o'clock at night over in Ireland, so I'm not quite sure what time it is wherever you are, but hopefully your day is going well and your night's going well as well. So I'm going to talk to you today about basically a session I call Rebooting Your Analytics Strategy with the Power Platform and Microsoft 365. Before I get into the details, just the quick little bit of information about myself. I've been working with data since 1999. Pretty much from the start, I've kind of specialized in business intelligence, particularly around OLAP analysis services, Tabular, Power BI, since all that time going on there. I own a company called DataSmart. I lead various user groups, run various data community conferences, Data Weekend or Data KLE, and regular speaker and data platform tasks. So that's all about me. You find me on my website, my Twitter handles, LinkedIn, etc. I do have a blog post that accompanies this talk. So if you find it of interest and you want to see a little more detail, you can go to the blog. Plus, there's some recordings of it online. So what this session is all about. This is largely based upon my experience of building reporting solutions using Power BI, Power Automate, SharePoint, Office 365, and Teams. So as such, what I'm going to be talking about and demonstrating in this session is Power BI, Power Automate, SharePoint, Office 365, and Teams. So if you're expecting to see something else, you're not going to see it here. This is what I'm going to be talking about. Before I get into that, I suppose I'd like to talk a little bit about Power BI and Data Projects 101, the kind of generic, bland, vanilla way you tend to approach data projects. There tends to be four key aspects to this. There tends to be a part where you're getting data out of source systems. So this in Power BI is using Power Query or M or get data, if you want to call it that. There then tends to be a section about modeling data, and modeling data is when we're taking that data that we've got out of source systems and we're putting it into a shape that suits our reporting need. And for this, we're going to be using Power BI Desktop. Then we get into the visualization stage of data, which is when we actually start creating reports on top of that data model. And again, we're going to be using Power BI Desktop, but we could also use PowerBI.com for this. And then finally, we get into the sharing of that work out with other people. Then we're using PowerBI.com. Lots and lots of data projects fall into that mode of get it, model it, visualize it, share it. Some don't. I mean, you can have data projects that will go straight to your data sources, but most of them will fall into this classification. And what I'm going to be demonstrating is very much based upon the get, model, visualize, and share approach. So let's talk about my demo, or my business requirements, as I call it in here. And this is based basically upon a combination of a couple of my clients, okay? So this client comes along and says, Mark, we've got data in a budget system, we've got data in our company sales system, and we've got data in our retail sales system. And there are three separate systems. So we want to report across those three systems. Three sources of data, they want to create some reports for their users. Their company sales, it's sourced from their internal ERP system. Their retail sales are actually in Excel files that they get from what we would call a data aggregation company. So i.e. a company that gets this business sells product into retailers and retailers sell it to consumers. So while their revenue comes from their sales to the retailers, they also want to get a sense of how their product is doing in the marketplace in general. And that additional data comes in via Excel files. And then their budget system is in Excel. They have got like many other companies, they use Excel for calculating and storing their budgets. So the rest of my talk, I've split into three phases. And it's kind of trying to reflect the way that you typically would approach a project, especially if you're learning about Power BI at the start, that you'll tend to probably do most of what I've done in phase one. But then if you want to go into different phases, you can do things a little bit better, add on some more functionality, and really try to embrace the whole Office 365 suite as well as the Power Platform suite going in there. Okay, well, phase one is really just about Power BI. Okay, So we're going to use Power BI to get data from our source systems. We'll be using it to model our data. We're going to be using it to visualize, and we're going to be using it to share via PowerBI.com. As such, my architecture diagram is going to look a little bit like this. So here are my three source systems: budget, ERP, and retail sales. There's also Forge down here, which I'm going to talk about briefly for a second. In this customer, their budgets and their company sales share a common product code. But when it comes to retail sales, the product code that's used is the product code used inside in the retailers, not in the company. So we need a little bit of master data to try to mash up those two codes together, which in the first variation of the system, it's very tempting to put that into an Excel sheet where you got a list of codes and you're simply mapping one from another. So we've got a fourth data source in here. We then want to, over here, we've got Power BI, and this is storing a model published up in the cloud, and people will connect to Power BI from their browser, from their phone to get to their reports. The bit in the middle is the on-premise gateway connector for Power BI, which allows Power BI to basically communicate with on-premise data sources. Okay, so this is the architecture we're going to come up with. So I'm going to now demo how you would kind of approach building that, demonstrate what you get out of it, and then we'll have a little bit of a critique of it, and then move on to phase 2. Okay, so let's quit out of here. And VM. So let's talk about what we got here to start with, a few little nuts and bolts behind this, all right? I've got a folder here and I got various files inside it. But first of all, let's talk about our company sales, which comes from an ERP. So I haven't set up an ERP in here, but I'm just going to use a SQL Server database to represent my ERP. And specifically, I'm using one of Microsoft's demo datasets, worldwide importers, and there's all the different tables inside, and I'm really going to be interested in these tables here: sales invoice lines and sales invoices. Okay, so that's my ERP side of things. I also mentioned that we got retail files in here. So these retail files are quite simple. They look something like this, basically, where you get an Excel file coming in here, and I've got an SKU code, I've got some descriptions about it, and then over here I've got values and quantities, how much of that product has been sold. That's my retail files. I've also got a budget file. So my budget file looks a little bit like this, where I've basically got a SKU and a description, and along my columns, I've got my budget values that have been put in for every month. And I find a lot of times when I see budget files inside an Excel, it looks something like this, laid out in columns, because accountants love columns. Okay, so this is my budget. And I want to touch a little bit briefly on that master sheet that I mentioned as well, which maps retail codes to company codes, and it looks a little bit like this. I've got codes down here, and over here in this column, I've got a map code section. So that's kind of what I'm starting from. They're the four things that I've got going in there. Okay, so let's close all of this down. This is my Power BI. I'm not going to take you through building the entire solution in here. I just want to give you a flavor of how you would approach it. What we're looking at here is my actual data model that I want to get to. Okay, I want to get to a situation where I have my company sales inside in a table, I have my retail sales in a table, and I have my budget data in a table. And then I want to be able to analyze that by my budget data. So you can see how budget is connected to all three tables. I want to be able to analyze it by time, and you can see how, again, time is connected to all three tables. And then I got customers. And customer in this case is actually only connected to two tables. It's not connected to budget because we don't budget by customer in this situation. This is data modeling. This is very much a Kimball star scheme approach to your data modeling going on there, which is always a very good practice to put into Power BI. I can simplify down the view a little bit by just flicking onto these different little layout plans going on. And it's always a good thing to have in your head, I suppose, when you start building solutions, if you have that experience that you can see, okay, I know the type of model I want to get to, but then how do I get to it? So that's what I wanted to get to in here, right? So starting from scratch, you're going to be doing something like getting data. And if I want to say focus on that budget sheet initially, the steps I'm going to be doing are going to be something like this. I'm going to go get my data from Excel. After a couple of seconds, I'll pops this and I go, okay, there is my budget data inside here. So I'm going to go open in that. That will connect to my Excel file, and after a couple of seconds, it will give me a preview of what it finds. Here we go. So inside in this file, it's found two tables, the actual sheet as well as the data table. It doesn't really matter which one I take. And then I love how Power BI always gives you this really tempting yellow load button from here. If only it was that easy. We're mostly going to be hitting this button beside it, the transform data. Okay, so let's click on my transform data. And that does a few things, and we suddenly see this. So now we've gone from Power BI into Power Query. Okay, and over here, there's been a few things done for us already. You can see there's a bunch of steps here have been created. There's a source step, a navigation, a promotion header, and a change in data type. And we can flick around, click on that, and replay things. Kind of going, okay, I can see that was my initial source. I can see how I made my navigation, and I can see how at the top I got my headers there. And then I can replay my promotion and replay my change in data types. Now I just want to try to finish this out a little bit more. Okay, so SKU is useless to me. I'm not really interested in that, so let's just get rid of that. Okay, so I've got the code in here now, and then I got my dates along here. And of course, dates along there is not what I want to have. Okay, so I'm going to select all of those columns, and we're going to go into an unpivot. So now I've done a big transform to get my data out of my columns to put it into a row level layout, which suits my reporting purposes. And then I'll probably start doing a little bit of renaming of columns in here just to tidy things up a little bit. Change this to a budget value in here. Again, maybe set a couple of data types in there that you're kind of going, okay, I want that to be reported as a decimal number, and I'm happy for that to be stock code and happy into there. And let's say I've decided that this is what I want out of it, and I may be happy with this budget sheet. You can see over here, what I've been basically doing is I've just been adding on more steps to my data, to my Power Query. And if I want to look at what I've generated in the background, let's go in here and look at Advanced Editor. And this is the code that's actually being generated for me. And this is my M code. Now, this is going to be important. We're going to touch upon this a little bit later on in phase 2 and 3. But this is initially what I've been creating in the background, though I've been doing it all through a click and drag interface. Okay, so I can continue on doing that through all the other sources of data, and I'll end up building my data model. Now, I've built my data model before, so let's have a quick look at what it is, and let's compare it to what I've done there. And I like to personally organize my queries a little bit like this. I like to have queries. I use Kimball and star schema notation a lot, so I still think context of dimensions and fact tables. I also have to have separate folders of reference queries. But if I was to go looking at my fact folder in there, I can see, okay, I got some queries in here, and there's my budget one. And it's very, very similar to the one that I just created in a matter of a couple of minutes with a little bit of a difference around date. And then there's my steps over there. Yeah, I can go switching on company sales. And I see here something that seems to be quite straightforward, a source and an expansion. But let's replay that a little bit. So if I look at my source, I actually see that my source seems to be, we can look at it in a couple of ways. I can see that my source is actually something called invoice lines and invoice header. And I can track that back a little bit and go looking at my reference queries. And inside my reference queries in here, I see a query called invoice header. And go back looking at its source. And this is where I go back to my SQL Server database. Okay, so really just building up a kind of whole hierarchy of queries to start using in ways that suit my data extraction process. Okay. That continues on into dimensions. And again, if I go looking at dimensions, I just got various queries in here along with some transformational work to get it all into the shape that I want. All right, so very much a data shape and exercise going on in here. You do all that. I'm not going to apply my queries for now. That's just a new query. You do all that and you should eventually end up with this world where you're kind of going, great, I've got my model, I've got my queries running, I'm extracting my data. I'm going to do my modeling by creating my joins between my different tables. And then that will allow me to get into a situation where I can turn around and go, okay, let's start creating reports. And then my reports are going to be basic enough for this presentation, but I'll put on a table and I'll go looking at my retail sales and I see that. And I'll decide to start looking at that by my customers or by my calendar. Let's see, let's look at my calendar for now and seeing my breakdown by calendar. And I kind of going, okay, that initially seems to be doing some work for me. Okay. I've got some rather basic reports created that are just, again, showing you the same thing, that I've got Power BI reports. The objective of my session today is not to show you how to create lovely reports. It's more to give you the concepts of how you approach a data project in general. But let's say this is my these are my reports I've created, and I want to draw your attention to this figure up here, because this figure 47K, I'm hoping, if all goes well, will update to I think 51 or 52K later on in this presentation, assuming that everything is working fine for me. Okay, so this is my report. Assuming we're happy with this report, if I go back to my 4 steps, I've taken you through 2 of them already. I've taken you through the whole let's get my data, and we've done our model inside of things in there as well. Now this is all about the visualization and reporting. So then we go on to the last stage, which is sharing it. And inside in Power BI world, we're going to go publish to Power BI. Sure, I'll save my changes. I'll apply my change later. That will connect onto Power BI. And then I will be able to turn around in here and make a publish to my Reboot My Analytics workspace, select, and that will go away and publish my data up into Power BI. So from a developer, my work is kind of done here. Okay, now we're into the user mode of, well, how do people actually work with my reports in there? So going out of here, the way they're going to work with the reports is by logging on to PowerBI.com. All right. So I've logged on to PowerBI.com, and depending on what your PowerBI.com environment is like, you're going to see different things. It won't look exactly what I'm looking like in here, but ultimately you should have something called a workspace. I have several workspaces. One of them is a workspace called Reboot Your Analytics. And I can go into my Reboot My Analytics, and I can go looking at my content. Inside in here, I see a report called Sales V1. I can click on that. And that's going to render that exact same report for me, except now I'm rendering it up inside in a website via Chrome or via IE or whatever is your favorite. And you get the normal interactivity that you saw in Power BI. On top of that, you're going to set up refresh schedules. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my data set, seeing here that there's a refresh schedule, and I should be able to go looking at the last time it's done its refreshes in here, refresh history. And you can see there's been several on-demand refreshes happening in there, and the most recent one was earlier today. Okay, and you can manage that, and you can schedule that. So as such, you kind of have your solution developed, rolled out, and in the hands of your users. So let's step back a little bit and kind of do a bit of critique of this. Okay, so let's pop back up my PowerPoint. So this is what we built. We did our demo. What I have here is what I would call your classic, your single Power BI solution. It works, it's effective, but it's what I would consider to be a very standalone bit of data. Okay, it almost feels a little bit alien to a company, particularly if you haven't used Power BI before, and it's suddenly kind of going, oh, go to this website and your reports are there. And it's not saying that it doesn't work, but it just feels a little bit isolated in there. Plus, I also had I had to create some additional data maintenance to make this thing work. And then that kind of feels a little bit awkward, because now you're saying to people, well, how would you maintain new codes? And you got to go to an Excel sheet to do that. And, where's that Excel sheet stored? Some little rough edges around it in there, but nonetheless, effective. Which brings me on to phase 2, which is what I call redesign and start to leverage in Office. Okay. So let's look what we got in here. We're still getting our data out, right? We still got to get our data out from a source system. So Power BI still plays a big role. However, I want to start utilizing data flows. One of the issues with my first Power BI report is my second one. Okay, so the first one is fine. All my code is inside my Power BI data set. But what if I have to create a second Power BI data model? And for some reason, I can't use the first one. There's some good reason that I have to have data in my second distinct model, but I need to share data. I need to get company sales into both of those models. So now I'm kind of in that awkward place of kind of going, okay, well, I've kind of already developed the company sales. So now must I go into another data model and redo those steps? Okay, I can do that. It won't take me that long. But then what happens in the future if there's a change to company sales? I'm then going to have to remember that it's in 2 models and update both of them. And what if it's in 3? And what if it's in 4? And what if it's in 100 of them? Okay, so that certainly feels like there's a rough edge in there. Data flows is a way of getting around this, where you abstract that information out of the data model and you put it into PowerBI.com as its own little service. So now any other of my data sets that want to connect to company sales can kind of go, well, I'll just connect to my data flow. So essentially it's ETL up in the cloud. I also want to bring Excel into play in here too, because with Power BI, is it an ad hoc environment? Yes, a user can create their own reports inside Power BI, but is it an ad hoc environment along the lines of you get an Excel pivot table? No, it's not. So sometimes pivot tables are a really good way of working with your data. So I want to introduce Excel into the mix in here. And finally, I want to introduce SharePoint and Teams, both as a way of maintaining data and also as a way of visualizing data. Now my architecture looks a little bit like this. So I've still got my 3 source systems, right? And I've still got my gateway connector because that all remains the same. However, I don't have this 4th master data sheet anymore. It's been replaced by a SharePoint list. On top of that, seeing as I have a SharePoint list, well, I might as well have a SharePoint page out there, which is used as an entry point for people to get into my reports. I've still got my data model, obviously. My data model still exists, and it's still published up in SharePoint, up in PowerBI.com. But then on top of that, and I still have my browsers and my phones to connect to this model. But alongside that, I've got Excel and Teams playing a role in here as well, visualization. So we've added on quite a few more bits and pieces onto this in there. Okay, so let's look at how we kind of go about getting that done. So I'm going to start with the data flows, and if I'm inside my workspace here again, we've seen the sales one, but I'm going to flick onto sorry, I'm going to flick onto my workspace, go into data sets and data flows, and inside in here with its lovely new icons, I've got my data models down here, but then with a different icon, I got something called company sales. And this is my data flow. I can tell you there's my type data flow. And if I go clicking on that, this brings me into an entity called company sales. I can expand out that entity. I see in here the data, the contents of this entity. I can go in and do an edit on this entity. And after a couple of seconds, I'm going to be brought into, and there it is, Power Query. I'm going to be brought into Power Query, actually running inside in the Power BI service in here and editable within the Power BI service. And there's my query going on there. Okay. Now, this is kind of interesting because actually what happens when you run this, when you refresh this, first of all, you can have an independent refresh schedule. So you can refresh this in its own refresh schedule as opposed to the same refresh schedule as your data set, Power BI data set. But actually also where it stores that data, it stores this data in a blob object sitting in a Azure Data Factory Data Lake Gen 2 storage. If you don't specify anything, it will put it into its own Data Lake Gen 2 storage. However, you can actually configure your Power BI tenant to use your own Data Lake Gen 2 storage, which means this is kind of an interesting way of getting data into a data lake. But for now, this is a service running in the cloud. So how will I interact with that in my Power BI model? Okay, so I'm going to go back to my VM here. I'm going to cancel that. I'm going to close off this Power BI one. And I've got another one ready to rock over here. So having created that in there now, the way I'm going to work it is I'm still getting data, right? I'm still getting data, but I'm no longer getting data from a SQL Server in this case. Okay, I'm getting data from Power BI data flows. So I connect on this. And after a couple of seconds, this will connect to my Power BI instance. And inside in here, I've got a few different data flows. And inside in here, I got company sales, and I can click on company sales. And I can look at it and I can see my data. And actually, this is one of those rare occasions where I could possibly skip the transform and go straight to the load, right? Because I kind of know that I've got the data done already. I'm just going to flick transform data anyway, just because I want to get into Power BI, into Power Query. So here's this company sales query brought in here now with if I actually go looking at the steps behind it, it's very, very simple. It's just a straight source and nav going on, okay? Source is bang, Power BI data flows, nav is just picking up a particular data flow in there. And here's that replicated up there, okay? Here's the actual one inside my V2 model. There's my company sales. Here's my 2 steps, okay? And if you remember in my first model in here, as part of my reference queries, I had a query that went to invoice headers and another query that went into invoice lines. They don't exist anymore now because all of this has been moved into data flow world. Okay, so to actually get something from here into a data flow can actually be very, very straightforward. If I was to say just go clicking on my budget one in here, which I haven't moved to a data flow at the moment, click on advanced editor, I can turn around and just copy all of that text. Then I can go back up to Power BI. Can add an entity into here. I can go build in one, or I can go clicking on blank query. Turn around, paste in my M again. I'll probably have a couple of more things to do in here, such as set data sources and stuff like that. But by and large, that's my code migrated from my data set into a Power Query. All right, so really can be a very, very quick thing to do. And then having done that, you're just reversing the process on the other side where you're going back down to your Power BI and going, okay, well, now that I've moved my query into data flow, I'm now going to go back to my Power BI data set and then connect to my data flow to pull down my data again. Let's look at some of the other differences in here. I spoke about my product map. All right, so my product map before was an Excel sheet in there. So now let's look what that's been replaced by. I'm going to go to SharePoint page here, open a SharePoint page, and I'm looking at a SharePoint list in here. So this containing the exact same data that I had before inside an Excel, except now it's up in a SharePoint list, which means it comes a lot more straightforward and feels a lot more secure in context of maintaining it. If I wanted to add on a new entity in there, I can go click on new item and populate one I wanted and needed. Alternatively, I can go into a quick edit mode and I can start directly inputting data in there. But I can secure this. I can lock this down. I can wrap it up. People are much less likely. In fact, they won't go adding in new columns or anything like that unless they had admin permissions on it. So having moved my Excel sheet into a list, it means then that I can go back to my reference queries in this case, and where I had a reference query called a retail to product map, I've now got a reference query called SharePoint SP retail to product map. And here's my steps for it over here. And it's just doing the usual connecting to files, except this time it's being connected to SharePoint. And that's connecting to my reboot. And then I'm navigating my way through it. I've picked up my SharePoint list. I'm removing columns. I'm cleaning it up. I'm getting to renaming. And I'm ending up with that exact same data shape that I had before, except now the source of it is SharePoint. And then I can reference that in my queries as I continue to do. And the shape is the key word in there, all right? Because really when you're using Power Query, it's all about just getting data and put it into a shape that suits. But once you have that a shape and you're changing it and you're getting it from a different source, once the shape stays the same, everything downstream still runs on top of it. So you can kind of make it quite straightforward to do new stitching at the back of your engine in there, so to speak. So we've touched on data flows, we've touched on my SharePoint list and how I can source data from my SharePoint list. So I feel I've improved a few things in my system in there now, okay? But let's look at from certainly from a developer point of view and from a maintenance point of view. But let's look at it from an end user's point of view, all right? So an end user before was going to PowerBI.com, which is fine and it works, okay? But it's kind of, it all feels a little bit too like me as and go to a different website to get to your company information. Now I'm using SharePoint, right? Which means I can basically have a SharePoint page that's hosting a Power BI report in it. So I'm running my reboot home in here and we're seeing lots of activity beginning to pop up all over the place. And basically there's a whole bunch of Power BI reports that start to render in here. So here's the one that I've been working on. Sorry, let's miss that. Here's the report that I was showing to you earlier. It's all interactive. There's my 47K figure. But on top of it, I've actually got a few more reports embedded into my SharePoint page in there as well, which are, again, Power BI reports. In fact, if we go looking at this one, I mean, this Power BI report is actually coming from the same data set that this comes, But these two guys are nothing at all to do with company sales. But I've decided, kind of partially for curiosity, for the last couple of years, I've been tracking the sentiment rating around #Brexit. And this is reporting on the overall average sentiment over the last couple of years, which is sitting at 0.49, so just slightly negative. And over here, I got on the average of the last 10, and it's reading quite low at the moment. So there seems to be a lot of negative sentiment out there about Brexit at the moment. Okay, so it's just showing how you can start kind of building up additional things once you're inside the SharePoint page. And now it feels closer to my users as well, right? Because if they're using SharePoint, then you're putting it right in front of them. But could we even bring it close to them again? So let's bring up a Teams environment. I have to do this on my VM because we're using Teams for broadcasting. We'll go into here. So this is me working with Teams, and in your Teams world, you can set things up in there. You set up your team. You can have your posts on it. You can have your files. You can have your wikis, etc. And then I've got these additional add-ins in here. So here's a Sales V1 tab, and I go looking at that, and that's rendering the exact same report for me again, except now I'm right in the middle of my Teams environment. And as I'm in here, I can start collaborating with people. All right, I can start communicating with people inside my organization. And they'll start getting notifications saying, okay, there's a message for you, and they can go into it and they start seeing the same data in there. So you're really beginning to bring your data closer to the way people are working with your to users' daily tools, which I think is very, very useful. In fact, just as a digression, there's another little one in here called Visio demo, and this actually is another Power BI report. It's a different talk in here, but this is another Power BI report that actually is integrated Visio inside in Power BI and then showing it up inside in Teams in here. The way this one works is I can go clicking on a Visio visual and getting a sense of how things are impacting around it. So you can see in there that as I click on different things, we're getting a sense of what was happening on the Visio process diagram behind it. But that's a bit of a digression. So now, from a user point of view, they're closer to the data because they're in SharePoint. They can use Teams to interact with their data in there as well. But I actually want to touch a little bit about the Excel ad hoc side of things. So let's go back to my SharePoint for a second, or sorry, go back to my Power BI for a second, go back to my model. So here's my Sales V1 in there. If I click on over there, there's this option to analyze in Excel. You can also get to it from a report as well, where you can be inside in Sales V1. And I can go up to here and then go analyze in Excel. So if I do that, a little download will kick off. It should kick off. There it is. So that's downloading ODC. If I click on that ODC, it opens up. So I'm going to enable. And after a couple of seconds, I'm going to have to re-authenticate. So let me just do that. So that's connected on in there now. And after a couple of seconds, it should give me a connection to my model. So here I'm now in the pivot table. All right, this is a pivot table connected from my Excel on-premise world to my Power BI data set. And if I go over here, I can see my data model that has been created. Okay, and I can turn around and start doing start creating a report in this one, where I can go start looking at my stock items and my unit price for it, and the brand of it, start getting a pivot table coming up, and then I can go in, because I'm in pivot table world, I can turn around and change my design a little bit. I'm going to change that to tabular layout in there. And I'm getting to basically starting creating a report, but in a full ad hoc environment that's sitting inside an Excel that I can do all that good Excel stuff within there. So from an analyst point of view, probably brought them significantly closer to really working with the data. And this is something I found that a lot of people adapt very quickly to. They find it a very kind of almost comforting way of working with their data, particularly if they've been in a circumstance where they've used Excel a lot and they've used pivot tables a lot. And that ultimately helps user adoption. So let's go back to my PowerPoint and see where we are in it. So this is redesign and start leveraging Office. So we spoke about all of this. And we've seen in here now how we can turn around and go, okay, keep these, but I got a SharePoint list to maintain my master data, use SharePoint as a presentation option back to users. Still got my data model. However, my data model from a tech point of view, from a developer point of view, feels a little bit better because one, I'm getting stuff from SharePoint for my master data, and two, I'm not reusing my code. Instead, I'm creating data flows to connect to my code. Then from the end user's point of view, yes, they can still work with it directly in a browser, but they can also work it in Excel, they can also work it in Teams, or they can interact with it via SharePoint. So it feels now like the whole thing's a little bit more rounded and part of my organization. So we've had the demo, single data source for multiple models, SharePoint Online maintenance, SharePoint dashboard. So a lot of good things in here along with pivot tables. Let's go on to phase 3. And there's a little rough edge in my solution still that I want to kind of see, can I improve on, okay? So phase 3 to me is all about automation and orchestration, okay? Workflow. Here's my diagram. So everything up here is as before. We're all the same coming down into here. This is the bit that's different, okay? And retail sales. So with my client, those retail sales files, they receive them via email once a week. And then the person who receives those files has to take them, open them, detach them, save them onto a network share, and then wait for the next refresh to happen, okay? And then they'll go on holidays and it won't happen, or they're out sick and it won't happen, or they're really busy in a day and it won't happen, all right? So there's a whole manual intervention in there. So using Power Automate, what we can do is actually create a Power Automate flow that monitors the inbox of the user. When email comes from a particular user, it will search that email, take the attachments, detach them onto the file share, and also trigger off a refresh of PowerBI.com and basically automate that little manual process. As well, for fun, this is where I brought my little bit of Twitter stuff in here just to explain a little bit more about data flow. So let's have a look at this. So here are my Power Automate flows that I've created so far, okay? And I've got one in here called Reboot, Save My Attachment, and Refresh, okay? So let's click on this. And here's my last time I ran this. So last time I ran this was on the 12th and the 19th, which is the last time I presented this session. So it takes about 4 seconds to run and succeeded. So hopefully I'm going to get another success tonight. Let's go looking at the design of this. And this is the whole Microsoft low code, no code way of developing, okay? So first of all, it starts off with a trigger event, which is when an email arrives. So I go looking at this, and there's a few things to check out. And to begin with, there's a connection over here, a connection to my Office 365 account. It monitors my inbox. It monitors my inbox for emails from this user. And it also looks for emails from that user that have the subject header reboot in it. So I'm getting quite specific on what I'm monitoring here. When that happens, it then runs an apply to each transform. So applies to each what? Applies to each attachment. What does it do? It calls a create file transform. So I have a look at the connection onto here, and there's a connection called reboot retail sales. If we remember that on-premise gateway connector, so far we have been using that to get data out of on-premise to put it into PowerBI.com, but it can go both ways. We can also take data and push it through that on-premise gateway connector to put data back onto on-premise, and the Power Platform can access that connector. So the Power Platform here is actually using that same connector to basically write to a file share. So that connection is basically a file share connection. So when an email comes in, it looks at each attachment, takes the attachment, creates a file, moves on to the next step. The next step is it connects to my workspace, reboots your analytics, sees data set V1, and it does a refresh of that data set. So that's my flow. So I'm going to trigger that flow, and hopefully it will all work for me. So I'm going back in here. This is my Gmail account, and you can see here how I've got an email all ready to go. There's to me from my email. I got reboot in the title, and here are my 2 files. So we're going to hit send on that. Okay, so that's sent. So all going well. What should happen here in 10 to 30 seconds is I should get a new file arriving into this directory. When that arrives into this directory, it should then trigger off a refresh of PowerBI, which will then connect down and pull up those new files. And I think we just saw an update there happening in front of me. So if I go looking in there now, I should see my December files. There's my 1 December file, and where's my other December file? Here's my other December file. So my 2 files have arrived now. And if I go to powerbi.com, go back looking at my refresh data sets, I can see that this has just refreshed. You can see there 11:45. So this certainly has refreshed. And if I go into edit, if I go in looking at my history in here, so just refresh down here, apologies. I can see in here 46 seconds ago, the trigger happened, 4 seconds succeeded. So the whole thing worked correctly. I've got my data. So the final test of all of this is I'm going to repage my SharePoint. And that 47 figure should have updated to, I think, 51. There we go. So we've managed to actually automate that whole process going on there. So now my guy can go on holidays whenever he wants, and the data keeps flowing. Let's have a quick look at some of the other ones that we've done inside Power Automate. That Twitter one is always an interesting one to look at. So looking at here, reboot, run sentiment analysis tweets. So if I click in here, you can see this runs quite a lot. Okay, ran 11 minutes ago, an hour ago, etc. Here's my connectors going on. It's got a connector to SQL Server. It's got a connector to a text analytics. It's got a couple of other ones going on there as well. If I go looking at the edit, what's happening here is when a tweet is posted. So it's connecting to my data guy connection. Apologies, I think I dropped off there, but I think I'm back now. Everybody can still hear me, yeah? Taken out as a yes. Yeah, okay. This runs my, this connects to Azure Cognitive Services, and then on top of that, it then inserts all that data back into a table called Reboot Twitter. So that's my example of running around in there, and that has been running away all the time, and that's what these visualizations are built and based upon, okay? So let's go back to my phase 3. Phase 3, all about automate and orchestrate, workflow, cool stuff. It's what we built up on it. And I suppose we saw the demo, and the key thing in here basically is we've now got automate file load and refresh going on, and we've had a little look at, I had a little fun with sentiment. So on this whole thing now, I now think on phase 3, we've got a solution that for the client is significantly more advanced and more native to them than with the phase 1. We got a solution that's more integrated with them. They can get to it in Teams, they can get to it in SharePoint. We don't have to have some guy doing some manual detach things and save things. That's just all happening automatically in there. When they go along and create a different data model and they want to reuse things like company sales, they can connect onto a data flow to bring in the data, as well as the normal, let's look at it via my mobile phones and look at it via browsers. So overall, a kind of much more rounded solution. And this is basically what we've been looking at really is what the Power Platform kind of represents in here, okay? We haven't looked at all parts of the Power Platform, but we've seen the Power BI side of it. I haven't shown you on Power Apps. We've looked in the Power Automate in there, and we've talked about our data connectors and how you connect onto your on-premise. And then over here, going along with all this, we've seen how SharePoint, Excel, Office 365, Dynamics all plays very, very nicely in this circumstance. Which brings me on to my conclusions. So conclusions about all of this. Using Power BI and Office 365, all sorts of reporting analytical needs can be addressed. You don't have to be IT to do a lot of this. I mean, those data flows, those Power Automate data flows could be created by non-IT for sure, but it really does help, okay? Data projects can get complex. I like to say this because sometimes I get the sense with Power BI that people almost think, oh, you don't need IT to develop things for you. Really, it really does help. All right, particularly if you get into some advanced modeling many-to-many situations or have to start creating some clever MDX, distinct counts, all that stuff. You could already own a lot of this stuff. A lot of organizations, if they don't have the Power BI infrastructure in place, they could well have the Office 365 infrastructure in place, which means they already have things like the SharePoint and the portals and the Teams and the Power Automate and the data flows to go along with it. So then when you add on the Power BI, you're getting a lot more things built on top of it. It's software as a service cost, so it can be expensive, or it can be amazingly cost effective. And I always like to kind of view this as it's like a game changer for the smaller organizations, because we love talking about big organizations with hundreds of users. Okay, but if we got hundreds of users, we got loads of different conversations we can have with them. We can look at Power BI Pro, we can look at Power BI Premium, there's all sorts of things. But what about the organizations that are still significant in their own right? They could be turning over millions, but they might only have half a dozen people who need to get into reporting. Historically, they'd have been looking at relatively expensive investment in licensing before they even got a line of code developed. Whereas now they can go into a software as a service mode and go, okay, I got my 6 users, I'll pay my $8.50 per user per month for my 6 users to run the reports, which is very much game changing, I think, particularly for smaller SME organizations out there. That's it. I'm happy taking questions in here. I'd also love any feedback or your evaluation. If you go to that URL, you can fill in an evaluation of how you found the session. And also this user group talk, I've got a blog companion that goes along with it, which you can find on my blog. And that's got talks through what I've been talking about, basically, as well as links to a recording of it online in there as well. All right. And that's it. That's all about me. So thank you very much for this opportunity to present to you. This is a charity event as well. So please, if you enjoy what you're seeing and you feel you can donate some dollars to UNICEF, that would be amazing. So we can get a little bit more money raised for a very good cause. And that's it. I'm online. I'm happy to take any questions if anything comes in there. All right, guys. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you so much.
Super, great.
And thank you for being part of the course.
No problem at all. My pleasure. My pleasure.
So there's a question for you, Mark. Do we create a separate set of front ends for PWA mode or website mode?
So a separate set of front ends for, repeat the last bit there, please.
For PWA mode or the desktop mode. I have published it for you.
So I'm a bit confused by what you mean by the PWA mode. That's the bit that's catch me in there. Like the desktop mode, I mean, to begin with, you don't create separate visualizations, all right? I mean, I'm always putting my visualizations, I'm creating them in Power BI Desktop and I've published them up into PowerBI.com. Or alternatively, you can create your visualizations directly in the PowerBI.com service in there as well. So there's options there about certainly where you create your visualizations. From my experience, I prefer creating visualizations inside in Power BI Desktop because I feel then I have an object that I can put into source safe and kind of protect, okay? And then publish it up into PowerBI.com. However, that does mean you have to have Power BI Desktop installed. You could have power users out there who are power in the sense of they want to create their own reports, but not power in the sense of wanting to ever get into data modeling. So for them, do you want to give them Power BI desktop? Maybe you don't, in which case you could always turn around to them and say, okay, you can create your own reports inside on the Power BI service itself, all right? Having done that, if you want to share those reports either via Teams or via SharePoint, it's the same link. Okay, you're not doing anything separate to put your reports into Teams. You are just connecting Teams onto Power BI, or in SharePoint, it's the same thing. You're just connecting SharePoint to Power BI. So hopefully that kind of answers the question. If I hope.
Yep. Thank you, Mark. Thank you so much for joining us today. And
No
please share
problem.
the event with everyone out there so that we can have some more fundraising out here. Thank you so much.
No problem, guys. Thank you very much.
Take care.
So
Bye-bye.
take care. Bye.